Welcome to this program is part of a series of exciting programs that the Poughkeepsie Public Library District is coordinating with many community partners, and we call it the NEA Big Read. This is an annual project where we have a piece of literature that we invite the community to read this piece of literature. This year, the literature is Lab Girl by Hope Jahren. It's a memoir, scientist, female scientist. And we ask community partners to participate by creating programs around themes of the literature. And we are delighted today to be collaborating once again with the Francis Lehman Loeb Arts Center for this program. My name is Jewel Ratzlaff, and I am the coordinator of the Big Read with the Poughkeepsie Public Library District. And today we'll be hearing from Dr. Jessica Brier of the Francis Lehman Loeb Arts Center. As I mentioned earlier, just a few housekeeping things. Please keep your mics muted to cut down on background noise. Although if for some reason something isn't functioning properly, please do let us know. Put your questions in the chat box area, and we will have a question and answer time at the end of the presentation. I am also recording this program, and I wanted to let you know that ahead of time, and to let you know that this recording, after it's edited, will be available on the Poughkeepsie Public Library District YouTube channel. And I would imagine that the Francis Lehman Loeb Arts Center might also want to have it on their website, and we will certainly make that available. So those of you who might discuss this program later with a friend who said, oh, I didn't know about it, I couldn't make it, rest assured that the recording will be available for viewing at a later date. So without further ado, I am happy to welcome Dr. Jessica Brier, the Decknatel Curatorial Fellow of Photography at the Francis Lehman Loeb Arts Center on the campus of Vassar College. And I'm going to turn it over to Jessica and let her give a little more background about her own bio, as well as the work that she does at the Francis Lehman Loeb Arts Center. And specifically today, her work with the Anna Adler cyanographs. So, Jessica, it's yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jewel. I am really delighted to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started. So as Jewel mentioned, I am a curatorial fellow working with photography at the Loeb Arts Center at Vassar College. I've been in this role for a little more than 4 months, so starting in a very interesting time, but I'm so grateful to be here and working with this incredible collection. My job includes research on the collection, cataloging, thinking of new ways to make the collection publicly accessible. So this kind of talk is a great example of that. And I have many other ideas that are in the works. Also working on exhibitions and thinking about how to support the continued growth of the collection at the Loeb Arts Center. I just want to thank Jewel so much for having me, and the Poughkeepsie Public Library for hosting me today. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Loeb Arts Center who helped me in preparing for this talk. I also want to dedicate this talk to my mom, who I know is in the audience. I have to embarrass her a little bit because I can't think of anyone in the world who likes the color blue more than she does. And as you'll see, we're mostly going to be looking at blue images today. So this is for her. So without further ado, we'll get started. We're going to be looking at one photograph in particular today. This is a photograph known as a cyanotype, and I will explain a little bit more of what that means as we go. It was made by the botanist Anna Atkins, and it is a botanical illustration. So this particular photograph is a real highlight of the Loeb's collection, partly because, as I'll discuss, it was one of the earliest photographs ever made. So really brings out this early moment in photography history, but also the history of science, and really seemed like a natural fit for the Big Read, given this year's book. And I should say this photograph is part of a collection of almost 5,000 photographs at the Loeb Art Center, and I'll be showing some other works from the Loeb's collection as well for context. So I'd like to show you first two views of this object. One is, the one on the right is the way that we usually encounter photography, either in a PowerPoint like this one, or even when we go to a museum or gallery and see a photograph in a frame, we tend to see this kind of straight ahead view just of the image. But I wanted to show you two views of the object to start with, to really highlight its status as a material object. So for me, as an art historian and a curator, the materiality of photographs and of all visual culture is really fascinating. And I believe that we can learn an immense amount from close inspection and handling of art objects. So during my talk today, I'll be showing you some of those close-up material views to really illuminate how and why this object was made. So let's begin with Anna Atkins herself. She was born Anna Children in 1799. She was born at Ferrex Hall, which was an aristocratic estate in Kent, to an aristocratic family. She was the only daughter of Hester Anna Hallwell and John George Children. She was their only daughter, and her mother tragically died when she was in childbirth, but Anna maintained a very close relationship with her father, who was a very respected scientist. John George Children was a fellow of the British Royal Society, and he served the British Museum in various roles, including as assistant librarian in the Department of Antiquities, then as keeper, somewhat like a curator of the 19th century, of the Department of Natural History and Modern Curiosities, which is a name that I love, and then as the first keeper of the zoological department. So John George Children worked with chemistry, with zoology, many different kinds of science. Their home, Ferrex Hall, where Atkins spent her childhood, included a laboratory that was a center for her father's research on electricity. He was known for making these massive batteries, and he would often host the chemist Humphrey Davy at his laboratory. So I mention all of this because there was a real porousness between the sciences at this time, much more so than there is today, and a lot of crossover between different areas of research. And this was really the context in which Anna Atkins was working, both as a botanist and as a photographer. And the three portraits of Anna Atkins that I'm showing you are from very different moments in her life. The one on the left-hand side is probably a self-portrait drawn by Anna Atkins when she was young. And then obviously a couple of photographic portraits of her. And these are among just a few images of Anna Atkins herself. And I am using these today to signpost three different ways of thinking about her legacy. First, as a forerunner of photography, secondly, as a visionary botanist, and thirdly, as an experimental artist. So we'll explore these three legacies in turn. So Anna Atkins is probably best known as an early practitioner of photography. The origins and inventions of photography are multiple and complex, a subject for another day. But suffice to say that one of the places where photography really got its start was in England by a photographer and writer known William Henry Fox Talbot, who was a close contact and colleague of both Anna Atkins and her father. Another early practitioner of photography who Anna Atkins was in close contact with was John Herschel, who discovered or invented, depending on how you see it, the process known as the cyanotype. And that is the process that Anna Atkins used to make her work. And on the upper left-hand corner, you can see one of John Herschel's very first cyanotypes. This cyanotype was made in 1842 when he first wrote his first recipe for this chemical process. The cyanotype is made with only 2 chemical compounds. It's one of the most simple photographic processes, chemically speaking. The 2 compounds are ferric ammonium citrate and potassium ferricyanide, which are combined to form ferric ferricyanide, which creates this blue pigment known as Prussian blue. The process, as I said, chemically is relatively simple and became a pretty inexpensive means of producing contact prints. So the way that the cyanotype by Anna Atkins was made is demonstrated through these 2 modern day photographs in the center and right. So the ferric ferricyanide would be used to coat a piece of paper. Then the plant specimens would be placed directly onto the piece of paper, and then the paper would be exposed to sunlight, to UV light, for around 20 to 30 minutes. Then the plants would be removed from the paper, and the print would be run under fresh water. The water itself is what actually fixes that image onto the paper, and it's a fairly stable process in terms of the image. So it was a great discovery / invention of John Herschel's. So each of these photographs made with this process is a unique object. This is not an infinitely reproduced photograph the way that we often think of photographs that were made from negatives. And you'll probably notice that I did not describe the use of a camera. That's because this is camera-less photography. And this kind of photography came to be known as a photogram. So I'll talk a little bit more about more modern and contemporary photograms a little bit later. But this was really a kind of chemical experiment in many ways. So in terms of the making of Anna Atkins cyanotype, which you see again on the right-hand side of the screen, she most likely used this framing device that is illustrated on the left. This is an illustration from a very early manual on photography from 1841, written by Robert Hunt, another English photographer and a contact also of Anna Atkins. This works a lot like a display frame. And a piece of paper is inserted into this box. The plant specimens are placed onto the paper, and then to hold them in place, there's a glass sheet that goes over top, and then it can be removed when you're ready to expose it to light. So this is a device that she would have used to prepare a composition for one of these illustrations, and then it would be brought outside to be exposed to the light. Now, Anna Atkins made hundreds and hundreds of these cyanotypes, and this was an incredibly labor-intensive process. Remember, these chemical compounds are not yet being commercially produced. They have to be mixed by hand. It's a very kind of toxic and labor-intensive process. So Anna Atkins by no means was working alone. She was aided by household servants, by her father, who was a chemist, and also by a very close friend named Anne Dixon. And in fact, the album from which the cyanotype from the Loeb's collection comes was made as a gift for Anne Dixon, and probably mostly in collaboration with Anne Dixon. So this is made not just by one early woman photographer, but by two. Anne Dixon is someone about whom we know very, very little. Like many Victorian women, there are very few of her personal effects that remain. But her legacy is preserved in some ways through this work that is attributed to Anna Atkins primarily, but certainly was also made by her as well. It's also worth noting, because Anna Atkins made so many of these, she needed ample space in order to make them, and access to space and to fresh water was something that was not afforded to everyone in this time. So this is to say, you know, her aristocratic standing was very much something that made this kind of early photography possible. I think often when we think of photography now, we really think of it as a democratic medium that is available to everyone. We all take pictures and consume photography all the time. But in many ways, early photography was a very rarefied practice. It wasn't available to everyone. And so I mention this because I think it's an important part of the context of the making of this work. And I should say, by this time, Anna Atkins had moved to another estate in Kent, even grander, in fact, than the one that she had grown up in. This was a place called Halstead Place. She'd moved there after she was married to John Pelly Atkins, who inherited both the estate and a Jamaican coffee plantation, which is how his family had amassed wealth. These are a couple more, much more close-up views of the object. And I'm showing you this because it's a reminder of how new this process was. What you're seeing on the screen are these white splotches that interrupt the blue tones of the image. So this is where the chemistry hasn't quite mixed together perfectly. So the idea here is that if the light is able to completely hit the paper, it should be registered by this continuous blue tone. But we can see these kind of chemical imperfections, which again, as a curator and as a historian, is really important as evidence of kind of this very experimental moment with early photography. And what you can also see from these views, we're looking at the photograph in what's called raking light. So looking at the view, at the object from a kind of oblique angle. And what we get from that is the way that the light reflects off of the surface of the object. So especially the one on the left-hand side, you can see that the surface of this object is quite matte. It's not glossy. You're not seeing my reflection taking this photograph. I'm not a photographer myself. So that's really a function of the object itself and the quality of the surface of the photograph. And this is just an example of the way that the cyanotype process has more commonly been used. It actually wasn't very popular among photographers. Not very many photographers actually wanted this blue, this Prussian blue tone. But where this did become quite popular was among architects. So the cyanotype is much more commonly known as a blueprint. And here I'm just showing an example of a blueprint of Taylor Hall, which happens to be where my office is at Vassar College. And as I said, this process was quite cheap. It allowed for photographic reproduction at a really large scale. So you can see why this process was so appealing and useful to architecture. And I also just wanted to mention as an aside, a couple of, these are the other two cyanotypes in the collection of the Loeb Art Center. So the one on the left is a contact sheet. Again, this kind of easy, cheap method of making photography lent itself well to making a contact sheet off of which you could decide which photograph you actually wanted to print. So this is by an unknown maker. We think it comes from Mexico. And then on the right, you can see an example of a cyanotype. This is rather unusual, just a kind of more straightforward landscape photograph made with this process. So just a couple of other cyanotype examples. Now, Anna Atkins is best known for a book called British Algae Cyanotype Impressions. The first volume, or I should say the first part of the first volume of this book was produced in 1843. And as such, it was the very first book that included photographic illustrations. The book was made, there were multiple copies. Each one is slightly different. They were gifted to specific people and now are kind of dispersed in various public collections, mostly public collections, some private. So the cyanotype in the Loeb's collection does not come from this body of work, but this is really the body of work that is best known by Anna Atkins. And as you can see, it is a book of botanical illustrations of British algae. And the book was not only printed, not only the images printed in the book were printed with the cyanotype, but in fact, the entire book is printed with the cyanotype process. So all of the pages that have text on them were also made photographically. So Anna Atkins hand wrote all of these pages. She either used very thin paper or oiled the pieces of paper that she wrote on so that light could penetrate them more easily, and then placed those pieces of paper on top of the cyanotype paper. So you can see the kind of outlines of the paper here. So we're looking at her inscription. This particular copy was inscribed to her father. An introduction in the center, and then on the right-hand side, a table of contents. Anna Atkins was not the only person using photography to make botanical illustrations, although this was still quite unusual. These are two of the very first photographs ever made by William Henry Fox Talbot. I mentioned him a little bit earlier as one of the first one of many inventors of photography. And as I said, a close contact of Anna Atkins and her father. And Talbot identified very early on the usefulness of photography to science and to scientific illustration. And these photographs were really meant to demonstrate that. So Anna Atkins wasn't the first to do this, but she certainly was the most prolific maker of photographic botanical illustrations at this time, and has become very well known for this. I also just wanted to show a couple of other examples of early scientific photography in areas other than botany. Photography was incredibly useful to a number of different scientific pursuits. The photograph on the left-hand side also comes from the Loeb's collection. It is an example of early astrophotography by Louis Rutherford, who was an American scientist, among other things. This is another real gem of the collection. And then I also had to show you this example on the right-hand side of the first X-ray photograph. So this is not part of the Loeb's collection, but just very important to this story of the intersections of science and photography history. This is made by Wilhelm Röntgen, a German scientist and doctor who created the first X-ray. of his wife's hand. You can see this little bulge on one of her fingers is her ring. And the X-ray has a really interesting relationship to the photographs that Anna Atkins was making. So I wanted to include this as well. So I'd like to now talk about Anna Atkins from a different perspective as a visionary botanist. What kind of contribution did she make to the field of botany? Anna Atkins was not alone as a woman in practicing botany. This was actually considered a profession, or I should say a practice, that was acceptable for Victorian women. It was something that women could do within the domestic sphere. Keeping plants, keeping an herbarium was something that was considered socially acceptable. There was also kind of association between the fragility and delicacy of plant specimens and kind of common understandings of femininity at that time. And this is an image illustrating this quintessential young woman botanist by Alfred Runner, a Belgian artist. This is another work in the Loeb's collection, and a nice illustration of kind of what the practice of botany looked like in this moment. The practice of botanical illustration dates all the way back to the 1st century of the Common Era. This is a 15th century copy of one of the very first illustrated volumes with botanical illustrations. The De Materia Medica, which was created by the Greek botanist Pedanius Dioscorides to help readers identify plant species for medicinal purposes. So what was different and I would argue visionary about Anna Atkins' work? Well, to answer that question, we have to compare her botanical illustration to one that was much more typical of this moment in the mid-19th century. So here we're looking at, on the right-hand side, botanical illustration by a Dutch illustrator, Bertha Hula van Newton. This was made, obviously, drawn and painted by hand next to Anna Atkins' Cyanotype. And as you can probably see right away, the illustration on the right-hand side obviously shows a lot of color and surface texture rendered by hand, whereas the cyanotype on the left-hand side, of course, has this blue tone. We've lost the colors of the original plant specimen. But what is gained, I think, is a real sense of the materiality of the plant specimen itself. And the major difference between these two is that while the illustration on the right-hand side is an ideal specimen, Anna Atkins' illustration is an exact specimen. And in that very first book about on British algae that she made in 1843, part of her introduction, Anna Atkins talks about why she had adopted the cyanotype process in order to make botanical illustrations. She wrote, "The difficulty of making accurate drawings of objects so minute as many of the algae and confervae has induced me to avail myself of Sir John Herschel's beautiful process of cyanotype to obtain impressions of the plants themselves, which I have much pleasure in offering to my botanical friends." So what she's saying here is she's expressing a kind of frustration with making accurate botanical illustrations with drawing. And she was really interested in kind of how to enhance the accuracy and precision of a botanical illustration, and she saw an answer in photography. So she describes here the cyanotype as an impression of the plants themselves. So this is really key, and this is a way that both Anna Atkins and William Henry Fox Talbot often described photography, not as an artist's interpretation or representation of something, of nature, but in fact, nature's own impression of itself made on photographic paper. So just for comparison, here are some early drawings that Anna Atkins did. The one on the left, a drawing of shells. I think you can see the kind of minute detail that she was after, that ultimately she found for herself more satisfying through photography. On the right is a drawing that she made of an elm tree that made its way into that was copied as a wood engraving in the Illustrated London News, another artifact of her family's incredibly well-connectedness in this moment. These are just a couple of examples of plant specimens actually arranged by Anna Atkins herself from her herbarium. She donated 1,500 specimens from her herbarium to the British Museum, what's now the Natural History Museum of London. And here I wanted to show you the actual plant in the wild, or I should say a different kind of photograph of this plant compared to Atkins' own cyanotype of this plant specimen. So the plant specimen in question is the Telea trifoliata, better known as the wafer ash or hop tree, and connoisseurs of botany out there will know better than me that this plant is actually not native to Britain. It is native to the United States. And this is significant because it allowed us to identify this cyanotype as coming from, obviously not from the book of British Algae, but in fact from a later album that was assembled in 1854, which I mentioned was gifted to Anna Atkins' good friend and collaborator, Anne Dixon. And this identification was done actually by a current Vassar student and a former intern who I was lucky enough to work with, John Mahoney. And he did great work in identifying this plant specimen, identifying the album from which it came. And he also made the very astute observation that because this plant specimen comes from the United States and not from England, it's also a kind of artifact of British imperialism. And I say that because Anna Atkins herself was never traveled out of the British Isles, but her father did. As a member of the British Royal Society, in that capacity, he traveled around the world, including to North America, and most likely collected this plant specimen on his travels. This kind of travel was really facilitated by British imperialism. And so this photograph is not only at the intersection of photography and science and art, but also this legacy of imperialism. And one more close-up view that I'd like to show you. This, or several more, I should say, this gives you, I think, a good sense of the kind of detail that Anna Atkins was able to capture in the cyanotype. So as I was saying earlier, I think what's really unique about her way of making botanical illustrations is the kind of detail that is captured. So because this photogram was made with light passing through or hitting an object, you can see the light has not been able to penetrate this more opaque leaf, but it has penetrated to some degree this more translucent seed pod. So we can see the seed within the pod. We can also see the minute detail of the of the veins of the seed pod, and these kinds of details are really rendered through photography. And this is just a close-up of the label, which was deciphered by John Mahoney, who I mentioned a moment ago, in really dating and identifying this particular cyanotype. So the final legacy of Anna Atkins that I would like to talk about before we open up to questions is as an experimental artist. Now, Anna Atkins did not self-identify as an artist, as far as I know, but I would argue that aesthetic experimentation was very much a part of her work and is very much at the center of why she continues to be such a compelling figure today, not only for historians, but also for artists. So here again, we have our cyanotype from the Loeb's collection on the right-hand side, and a couple of the title pages of the album from which this cyanotype came. And I think what you can see in the two images on the left and at the center is that she's really playing with this cyanotype process here. These are not straight ahead objective botanical illustrations, but rather she's really using the plant specimens in kind of a decorative way. And in this album, she really was able to kind of branch out, no pun intended, in terms of both the kind of style of these photograms and also the content. And she'd actually been, I think, experimenting with the aesthetics of her work from the very beginning. This is, I love this. This is a detail of lettering that she created in one of the first copies of her first book back in 1843. And the lettering is made with these delicate seaweed strands that she has arranged in letter forms. So these are really handmade letter forms made out of the seaweed strands, which I think are really, really beautiful and really speak to a kind of playfulness that is at work with her. So here are a few other examples of the cyanotypes that came from this later album. So she's not only making photograms of plants, but also feathers and lace. So really looking at different kinds of textures, the way that light passes through different kinds of materials. Obviously, she's arranging them in various ways on the paper. Again, this is not really about objective representation per se. And you may have also noticed in my various views of this singular photograph that the color, this Prussian blue, looks rather different depending on which image we're looking at. And granted, some of the images I've shown you are digitally color corrected, but my own photographs of this object, I think, show how different this pigment looks from different angles and at different distances from the object. This is a color that really sort of changes as you move around it, handle it, are in different kinds of proximities to it. And this is also a process, this cameraless photography process that creates the photogram. It's also one that's rather finicky. And there are a lot of imperfections in these images if we look closely. So for example, you can see some blurry areas here on the leaf here. These are places where the specimen probably moved a little bit during this long exposure of 20 to 30 minutes. And I point these things out because I think there is something inherent to the cyanotype and to cameraless photography that really lends itself to a trial and error or kind of playful way of working, because there's so many elements of chance that go into making these photographs look the way that they do. And if you want to get a sense of what I mean firsthand, I highly recommend trying this for yourself at home. You can buy these chemical solutions pre-mixed and coat your own paper. Or even easier, you can buy a sunprint kit that it comes with pre-coated cyanotype paper and make your own photograms at home. You'll find that it's really tricky to get exactly the kind of image that you want. This process really lends itself to kind of trial and error, or I would say it requires it. And this aspect is something that artists, more modern and contemporary artists, have found incredibly compelling. So I just want to end by showing you a couple of examples of the way that artists have used this cameraless photography, the photogram, that really show this kind of long legacy from Anna Atkins into the present. So this is a photogram by Laszlo Maulinage, a Hungarian-American artist and writer and designer. He was famously a teacher at the Bauhaus in Germany, and then was among those who established the new Bauhaus in Chicago in the 1930s. And I think, as you can see here, he's really playing with that blurry quality that often happens in a photogram. He's moving different objects around at different distances from the paper, playing with not out in the sun like the cyanotype, but playing with this in the dark room to create abstract compositions, and really embracing that element of chance that is kind of inherent to this process. One of his students was Arthur Siegel. This is another work in the Loeb's collection. Arthur Siegel was a student of Maulinage at the new Bauhaus. And here's another example of an artist using this cameraless process to play with motion and to really capture a sense of motion in the photographic emulsion. There are also many women artists who use cameraless photography and make abstract photography, many of whom cite Anna Atkins as an influence. This is the work of Danielle Teter. She is actually native to upstate New York, making these abstract compositions. She primarily works with painting and drawing, but these are some of her lesser known photographic works that are in the Loeb's collection. And again, really playing with movement, the transparency of materials, how you can register the quality of different materials photographically. Here's an example by Ellen Carey of two works using cameraless photography and color. So really kind of pure abstraction. You can really see this kind of essential understanding of photography as the action of light fixed on paper that she's using. So really kind of reaching back to the origins of photographic chemistry. And finally, this is an artist, Clare McKenna, another contemporary artist, using the cameraless photograph to make this beautiful image of rain. This is part of a larger body of rain studies that she created. And I love this in relation to Anna Atkins' work, because it is an abstract photograph, but it is also a photograph made in some ways by nature, or as a kind of impression of nature, in this case, droplets of water. So we're both kind of looking at these droplets on the photographic surface captured through photographic materials, but it also looks as though we're looking through a window covered with rain droplets. So I will stop there and open things up to questions. And thank you all so much for your attention.
Wow. Thank you, Jessica. This is fascinating. So we have a question. How easy was it to reproduce the Prussian blue, and was British Algae Volume 1 mass produced?
Well, I would say the cyanotype, that Prussian blue color, it doesn't only exist in photography. It's a pigment that already existed in other mediums. but I would say photographically, it's very hard to reproduce. So it's much easier to mix it as a pigment, you know, a pigment, you know, to use for painting or drawing rather than photographically. It's really only the ferric ferrocyanide that creates that Prussian blue. And no, her books were not mass produced. So now we have some nice facsimiles that are in some of the secondary literature on her work. But there are about, I believe, 17 known copies of British Algae. They're all, as I said, kind of scattered around the globe in different public and some private collections. And each one is very different. Each one has a sort of different configuration of images, different tables of contents. Not all of them are even exactly the same as each other. And as I said, every image anyway is a unique image. So even to call them copies is a little bit of a misnomer because all of her work was truly unique.
Wow. It would be interesting to see if Vassar's herbarium has a wafer ash specimen and where it came from. They have many 19th century specimens like those you showed belonging to Atkins. Do you have any comment on that?
No, except to say thank you so much. As I said, I'm somewhat new to Vassar, so that is such a great idea for continued research, which definitely will continue on this object. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
And someone also asks, how many Anna Atkins botanical prints do you have, or specimens do you have at the library, at the museum?
Just one. Yeah. So there, although she made many of these photographs, they are rather rare. So, and most of them are bound in volumes and weren't split up. So the album that this particular cyanotype comes from, that I've been speaking about, was split up and sold at auction in 1981. And as soon as it was sold, it was completely dispersed. So we actually don't even know exactly how many images were in that particular album. But suffice to say, these are hard to come by now, especially as Anna Atkins has become this really beloved figure in the history of photography, for artists. So we're very lucky and thrilled to have this one example in the collection.
Great. Can you speak a little more about the toxicity of the chemicals used, and are the ones in modern kits toxic?
Yeah, they are toxic chemicals for sure. I was thinking about that when I showed those two images of the kind of modern day demonstration of the cyanotype process. The person in that photograph is wearing gloves, which you should absolutely do. I highly recommend that. I have stained a couple of pairs of shoes doing this process myself at home. So definitely wear gloves. Yeah, photographic chemistry is incredibly toxic. Anyone who's worked in a dark room is probably familiar with that. You have to go outside and take breaks. And this process is no different. It is definitely handling toxic chemicals. So a word of caution.
Fantastic. Interesting. Can you describe how the landscape cyanotype you showed us was made? Was it a negative contact?
So that was a positive print. So most of the images I showed you were negative contact prints, right? That's why the image was white instead of blue. But then in the landscape example, that is an example of using the cyanotype, just printing in the darkroom on cyanotype paper. So I mentioned that blueprints were a common use of cyanotypes. So by that time, by the 1870s, the cyanotype paper had become commercially available and industrially produced. So that particular print would have been printed on cyanotype paper that was pre-coated, sold in a package, and then would just be developed in the darkroom like any other print, except it was blue.
Fascinating. Yeah. Is there a biography of Anna Atkins that you could recommend?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if there is. I'm not sure if there is a biography of her. The most kind of comprehensive study on her is a book called Sun Gardens, and Larry Schaff has been, SCHAAF, has been a historian who's really been sort of the most prolific writer about her work and her life. The book that I'm referring to was published by the New York Public Library 2 years ago. And it's this incredibly comprehensive study of her entire body of work. They've tracked down, most of the locations of her photographs that still exist. And there's quite a bit of biographical information there. But I mentioned this in my talk, but even for someone like Anna Atkins, there really aren't there's not much record of her life beyond the photography that she made. I mean, she created an incredible record of her own, both in her herbarium and through her photography. But in terms of papers, there's not a lot. And she didn't have any children, so this was part of why she donated her herbarium, those plant specimens, to the British Museum. No one inherited her papers. So I think a lot of the details of her life are really lost, but certainly there have been some historians who have pieced together aspects of her life.
A quick search of the library, Mid-Hudson Library System, shows one biography for children. And it's called The Bluest of Blues. Anna Atkins and our first book of photography.
Very cool.
Any other questions? We've had some lovely comments about how interesting, informative this has been. Do we have any other questions before we close this out? Well, I guess, all right, I guess that's it. Well, Jessica Brier, I do want to thank you so much for all your fantastic research and sharing all of this great insight into the work of Anna Atkins. And I find it inspiring, and I hope that folks take the opportunity to go and visit the Francis Lehman Loeb Arts Center. Do you happen to know, I'm going to put you on the spot here, the hours now because in COVID, like what the hours are for the public?
Yes, so for the time being, we are open to the public on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and on Sundays from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m.
All right.
And then we have days and hours that are just reserved for the Vassar community during the week.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, please come and visit the museum on a Saturday or a Sunday. We would love to see you in person.
Fantastic. And the Big Read continues through November 7th. We have lots of interesting programming happening between now and then, book clubs and documentaries and films and hikes and all kinds of fun discussions. So you can get all of the information on Big Read at www.poklib.org. That's the Poughkeepsie Public Library District's website. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Jessica, and the Francis Lehman Loeb for making this possible. Have a great weekend. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Goodbye.